What was it like to be arrested on suspicion of being Jack the Ripper? Well, in this video, we're going to hear from somebody to whom that actually happened, not once but twice, and both arrests were on the same day. Our protagonist in this story was an unnamed 25-year-old reporter from the Methodist Times, who, having gone into the district to gather information about the plight of the poor, found himself arrested on suspicion of being the Whitechapel murderer and was marched off to the police station, followed by an angry, baying mob. His subsequent report about his experiences, which appeared in 2 issues of the paper, the first on Thursday the 29th of November 1888 and the second on Thursday the 13th of December, provide us with a unique insight into not only the mood in the East End as the autumn of terror was giving way to the winter, but also into the way in which the police were conducting their investigations into the crimes and the type of interrogation a suspect taken in on suspicion might expect to be subjected to. So let us join the Methodist Times' special correspondent as he recounts his experiences of being suspected of being Jack the Ripper. The Whitechapel murders. Our special commissioner twice arrested. To be arrested not once but twice in one day on suspicion of being the Whitechapel murderer is an unusual experience and, as I have found, although transparently innocent of any connection with the awful atrocities recently perpetrated in that neighbourhood, a dangerous position in which to find oneself. Such was my misfortune on Saturday last. I spent almost every night last week in Spitalfields and Whitechapel in order to obtain, for journalistic purposes, information and facts, not so much in regard to the terrible crimes which have won for Whitechapel the name of the East End murderland, as in regard to the life, habits and customs of the inhabitants of that dark and dismal locality. I never for a moment entertained the slightest fear or thought of ever being marched off to a police station and followed by a howling crowd as Jack the Ripper, whom nobody would be more delighted to see as securely in the hands of the leading detectives of the East End as I was on Saturday at midnight and for about 3 hours later. The circumstances of my arrests will doubtless be read with some interest. The heart-rending scenes and the many shocking incidents which have come under my notice during my week's perambulations will appear in these columns later on. On Friday I was out all night prowling about the neighbourhood. About 2 o'clock in the morning I went to the coffee stall which stands at the junction of Whitechapel and Commercial Roads. On several occasions while returning from slumming expeditions in the East End, I called at this stall in the early hours of the morning when I found gathered around it homeless outcasts and wretches of humanity to whose strange and eventful histories I have listened with great interest. While drinking a cup of coffee, a young woman, whose occupation I at once knew without the information she volunteered, "I'm one of them unfortunates, you know," ordered a cup of coffee, for which she tendered the price 1 penny, remarking as she did so, "I can't have nothing to eat, 'cause I ain't got no money." She gratefully accepted my offer to pay for a piece of cake. This charitable act on my part was observed by 3 youths, whom I was afterwards told on good authority were well-known criminals, who at once either concluded that I was a good mark for them, or that I was a very likely person to have done the recent fiendish work in Whitechapel. On leaving the coffee stall and proceeding citywards, the 3 young loafers followed me, they being meanwhile engaged in earnest conversation. "They whispered into one another's ear," said the lad at the coffee stall to me afterwards, "and I knew they were up to no good. I could have warned you of the danger, but if they had seen me do so, they would have turned round on me." The 3 cowards, as they in my opinion were, contrived to get into conversation with me, and the theme in everybody's mouth about Whitechapel became ours. Did I agree with them that Jack the Ripper was a very clever, shrewd fellow? I did, and suggested that he must plan carefully beforehand all the deeds of which he was the reputed author. Would I be surprised, they asked, if he turned up again and committed other similar crimes? No, I said, I would not, as he had been so successful in stamping out, so far as he himself was personally concerned, all trace of his bloody deeds, and to elude the police authorities. These young men entertained the opinion which prevails to a large extent among a certain class in the East End, namely the public-house loungers and those who profess to be atheists, that Mr. F.N. Charrington, one of the best friends of the poor, the fallen and the outcast, in his anxiety to clear Mile End and Whitechapel of immoral women, has had a hand in the murders. "You know this," vehemently ejaculated the most desperate of my 3 cross-examiners, "that Charrington ain't right in his head, that he's a religious lunatic, and he thinks he's doing good and pleasing his God by doing away with them poor women." This insane idea, as may be imagined, I could not help scornfully laughing at, and added that I knew Mr. Charrington, who had done all he could to help into a better life the class of women to whom the Whitechapel victims belong. This was too much for my friends, who now burst out with the confession that they had suspected me whenever I made my appearance at the coffee stall, and now that I had admitted that I knew Mr. Charrington, they had no doubt within their own minds that I had something to do with the murders, about which they also considered I knew rather too much. Besides, what was I doing at an early hour, mooching through the streets alone? Surely I had a more than usual amount of daring and strength of nerve before I would be going out companionless in that neighbourhood of terror. Putting all these facts together, was there not ground for suspicion? Of course there was, and they called a policeman, an apparently reliable officer, who happily, unlike the other two of whom I have to speak before I conclude, did not lack intelligence and common sense. He ordered them about their business, advising me for my own safety to go in an opposite direction. This I did, and I did not fall across my pursuers again. Their true object, it may be stated, was either to rob me or to intimidate me by giving me in charge. Wishing to find out whether there was any truth in the statement that whenever the doors of the public houses were opened in the morning, crowds of the women of the neighbourhood rush in and indulge heavily in drink, and that since the most recent murders they were, when funds permitted, intoxicated from morning till night, I entered a public house in Commeical Street, Spitalfields, between 6 and 7 o'clock, where a number of men and women were drinking together. I had not been more than 2 or 3 moments in the bar when I heard such whispers as these pass from one to the other. "I'll stake my life that's him." "No, 'tain't too tall." "Why, you bloomin' ass, he's got blue eyes. A man with blue blinkers wouldn't do such a thing." Then a youth who had just come from a doss house hard by, after speaking with the women in the compartment, came up to me and asked my opinion about the murders. I declined to express any. Next he inquired, "What do you think, sir, is Jack the Ripper's object in cutting up them poor things?" I replied to the effect that it seemed only a thirst for human blood. Little more was said. The young man with another disappeared from the house, and as I was about to take my departure, I was confronted by a police constable in uniform, one of the youngest and most inexperienced looking that I have seen in the Metropolitan Police Force. With a stern countenance and a determined look in his eye, he, without ceremony, or begging pardon, politely, as police officers as a rule do at the outset of a cross-examination, inquired, "What's this you've been saying about human blood?" I asked what he meant. He called in the young man to whom I have referred, and some 6 other men who had not been inside the house before at all, and who could not therefore have heard any remark which I passed, and they all declared that I made some fearful statements about human blood. The policemen, however, seemed to place reliance upon their false stories, and discredit all I said. At any rate, he took me outside the public house, where a considerable crowd had already gathered to see the famous man who was now in the clutches of the guardians of the peace. The constable beckoned 2 brother officers who stood not far off towards him, the crowd meanwhile directing most abusive remarks at myself, but these 2 policemen distinctly refused to approach their companion and his charge. One had advised him not to listen to my accusers, and not by any means to challenge or arrest me, and now he said, "I told you the risk you were running. You've done it all yourself, and you'll have to suffer for it." To Leman Street Station I was marched, the crowd hooting and yelling, gradually increasing as we went along. My accusers, who by the time we reached the station had multiplied in some mysterious manner to 13 or 14, the anticipation of the large reward had no doubt something to do with this, walked on each side, behind and before us 2. On reaching the station, those who had the serious allegations to make against me were ranged along one side of the charge room. I myself stood in front of the inspector's desk, the policeman beside me. After all the men had repeated and corroborated each other in regard to my extraordinary statement about the human blood, and it took some time to do this, they were asked to retire, but showed no disposition to do so. The inspector, a shrewd, businesslike officer, told them that they were no longer required. "But," cried a man with a deathly pale face and a huge worsted cravat rolled round his neck, "what are you going to do with him?" "I intend," replied the inspector, "to let the gentleman go." "Well, I'm blowed," was the rejoinder of the same person. "That's a fine thing, after us coming down here and giving that valuable information. Why, sir, the man ought to be searched." With this sentiment the others heartily agreed. "Look, what's that bulging out under his overcoat? Who knows what that is?" I here unbuttoned my overcoat and withdrew from the back pocket a notebook containing shorthand notes. The company seemed astonished and disappointed, and after a few more words from the inspector, they left, murmuring, however, that they might have another chance of catching me. So large a crowd had congregated outside the front of the police station that it was considered unsafe for me to go out there. They would, in their present state of excitement, undoubtedly have attacked me. I was therefore, after being detained some time longer, to my great relief, slipped out at the back of the office. Even at that time the crowd was hanging about in the front. But the most excitable event had yet to come. Anxious to see the scenes of the murders and a glimpse into life in Ratcliffe Highway, I undertook to show about on Saturday night the secretary of the Methodist Times Company and a literary friend of that gentleman. We first of all visited Mitre Square, then George Yard, Bucks Row, and after an hour or so in and about Ratcliffe Highway, we returned to Spitalfields, inspecting the scene of the latest outrage, that committed in Miller's Court, Dorset Street. About this stage our literal companion left us, and the secretary and I continued our perambulations, passing through many of the wildest and darkest back streets in Spitalfields. And before proceeding further, I might mention an important fact with reference to our police administration, and it is this. While the leading thoroughfares such as Commeical Street swarmed with uniform and plainclothes constables, there was not an officer to be seen in the sort of places, such as Bucks Row and Berners Street, where the crimes had been enacted. It is not, in my opinion, at all surprising in the present beat arrangements that the Whitechapel murderer has so successfully baffled every effort of the police to catch him. I have remained more than half an hour in one short street without seeing or hearing the tread of the man in blue. But to the point, I went to Bishopsgate Station with the secretary, who left for his home at Leytonstone shortly after 11. I walked slowly back through Spitalfields, and, wishing to see the inside of a public house in full swing about closing time, I entered the private compartment of a huge place situated directly opposite Dorset Street. There I encountered two men who turned out to be detectives. They were not, it should be explained, detectives connected with the police force, but amateurs who, with the reward in their minds, had, like so many others, resolved to devote their leisure time to tracing the author of the crimes. On entering the bar, the first thing I did was to lean over the counter in order to obtain a bird's-eye view of the other compartments in the place. These presented a sad sight. They were crowded with men and women in every stage of intoxication except what is known as incapable, that is, so drunk that they could not stand. There were also boys and girls of 16 and 17 years of age, indulging freely not only in liquor but in the roughest horseplay. Animated quarrels among the adults were being carried on all around, coupled with challenges to "come outside and have it out with our fists." Inebriated as the great bulk of the customers were, they were still being supplied with drink, notwithstanding the recently issued strongly worded regulation on this subject from the late Commissioner of Police. This, however, like so many other excellent laws relating to the liquor trade, is seldom enforced by the authorities and consequently ignored by the publicans. The fact of the matter is that the relations between the publicans and the police are, as I may perhaps prove in detail in these columns at some future time, of far too familiar a character. It is advantageous for the liquor seller to be in with the copper on the beat, and the policeman finds it profitable to be polite and respectful to the publican. During my 2 or 3 minutes' sojourn in the house, I was struck with the fact that there were more women in the various compartments than men, and the former were more intoxicated than the latter. I made an observation to this effect to a man at the counter, who in a most sympathetic tone said, "No wonder, poor things. They're living in terror, and they're drinking to nerve themselves. Everyone's expecting it'll be her turn next with Jack the Ripper. I wish I could run again the beast." "I'm sure we all wish he were caught," I observed. "I should certainly like to see the murderer brought to justice." "Justice?" excitedly exclaimed my conversationalist. "What do you mean? He don't deserve justice." And this was supplemented by a wretched-looking woman in middle life, who had just swallowed a glass of rum, with an exclamation which had reference to myself and was uttered in the broad Irish brogue. "By the Holy Church of Rome, I believe that's Jack the Ripper." I could not help smiling and remarking in an offhand sort of manner that it was not the first time I had been taken for that notorious character, and added, without ever for an instant anticipating a repetition of my morning's experience, that I had actually been arrested once. Cruel fate! Again, I had committed myself. The two amateur detectives staggered back. The suspicions regarding me, which they had been forming from the moment of my first appearance, they now decided were well grounded. They disbelieved my statement about being arrested, looking upon it simply as a blind, so they determined to make my supposed lie a fact, and this was how they did it. Said the one who acted as a spokesperson, "Step outside with us for a minute." I did. A policeman stood at the corner. Without another word, I was walked up to him and given into custody, with the confident hope that if I was not the actual perpetrator of the Whitechapel murders, I had something to do with, or at least knew something about these shocking crimes. The news spread like lightning that another arrest had been made, and in less time than it takes to write, I was the despised, the threatened object of a rough, excited and drunken mob, which, had it not been for the protection of the police, plainclothes-men were now numerous, might have carried out the oft-repeated advice of the collected crowd when an arrest is made and the prisoner mistaken for the murderer of "lynch him." All the elements necessary for such a purpose were present in the crowd that followed us to Commeical Street Station, on reaching which I was placed in the charge room while my two informers and the policeman stepped into the superintendent's room. What report they made I do not know, but I was called into the presence of the superintendent shortly afterwards, and I was not so dull as not to see from the demeanour of that experienced officer that I was not to get off so easily as I did in the morning. I of course readily gave my name, address and occupation, and declared my innocence. But all this amounted to nothing as compared with the evidence which had been tendered by two illiterate civilians and a constable of less than average intelligence. I was, therefore, not as I expected, at once released. No, the leading detectives engaged in trying to trace the murderer were hastily summoned from various quarters, and with their arrival began what a great many people would regard as a kind of comedy, but to me it was the passing through the hardest ordeal of my life. Let me give some idea of the proceedings. I was, of course, recognised as having been taken that morning already, and this was paraded as a grave point against me. It seemed strange and serious that I should be suspected and arrested twice in one day. I took quite another view, and instanced in support of it the action of the inspector on duty at Leman Street in the morning in taking the statements of my accusers simply for what they were worth, nothing, and allowing me to go. Then my previous night's movements, which had been watched, became the theme of examination. "What was I doing out all night?" asked one officer. I replied that I was exploring the neighbourhood for journalistic purposes, that I had been doing so till 1 and 2 and even 3 and 4 o'clock, nearly the whole week. The gist of other questions asked me may be gathered from the following answers. It was quite true that at these small hours I had alone visited the scenes of the tragedies. No, I was not afraid to do so, and I did not think that I was a man of exceptionally strong nerve, possessing more than an average amount of daring and foolhardiness. I knew what fear was, but apparently not to such an extent as some of the policemen on the murder rounds, who shirked certain portions of their beats. It was a fact which I had no reason to conceal that I had, during the week, conversed with many unfortunates, and that I had even provided some of them with means with which to obtain a night's shelter, and, more than that, but this answer was not considered worth asking, though the fact must have been as well known to the police as any other which they brought forth, I gave several the address of a Christian lady who would not refuse to help them if their cases were deserving, and who has reclaimed from Ratcliffe Highway and other dark spots in the East End hundreds of women and girls now leading respectable and honourable lives, dutiful wives and loving mothers. It was likewise the case that I reported to the police and signed a statement to that effect that I believed I had actually been attacked not only with the tongue but with the fists of a man whom I believed to have some connection, if he was not himself the fiend, with the bloody deeds of which I was now accused. I cannot enter into the details of this incident now, but after what this ruffian fearlessly declared to me and to others around me, I cannot divorce from my mind the feeling, rooted with me at the time, that he of all others ought by this time to have been in the merciless grasp of the police. So far as I have learned, though a minute and careful description was given of him, and though the detectives were on his track within 10 minutes of the time he aroused suspicion, he has not been seen or heard of since. Judging from outward appearance, there was no one more capable of committing such outrages. I said that at the time, I said it on the occasion of my midnight arrest, and I say it here again. But the question to which most importance seemed to be attached was this, put by one of the superior officers in measured and magisterial-like tones. Can you give an account of yourself on the night of the 8th of November? The date of the last murder. Every eye was fixed upon me, and breathless silence reigned while the reply was given. I was at home. What was I doing at home? I ventured, for the sake of illustration, to answer the inquiry in this way. I was doing indoors what the policemen of Spitalfields seemed to be doing on their beats, sleeping. From 11 o'clock on the night of the 8th till nearly 1 o'clock the following morning, when I went to the city and for the first time heard of the deed of which I now stood suspected, I was at home. My answer was not credited. How could they believe it? It was simply my own statement, and what meant that agitation and trembling now becoming apparent in me? Who, I should like to know, could remain cool in the circumstances? Half a dozen responsible and presumably sagacious men trying to persuade a young man of 25 that he was the author of the most horrible and savage deeds in the annals of the crime of this great London. Police evidence and theories almost uncorroborated have sent many an innocent man to penal servitude and a few to the gallows. Is there anyone who can back up the statement you just made? I was next asked. I told them my people at home would be able to do so. They decided to send an officer to my home, but to this I objected, on the ground that there was sickness in the house, and if a police constable were to go and state that I had been arrested a second time, the shock might have a very serious result upon the invalid. My objection, after a few minutes' consultation, was sustained. But remember, not for your sake, remarked an officer. I referred them to several gentlemen who knew me and who I thought could testify that I was not a very likely person to commit a murder. I desired them to communicate with the editor of this journal, but this they would not do. Refusing to do this, what were they to do with me? Were they going to lock me up or set me at liberty? Another consultation followed, the result of which was to me the happy announcement, "You may go," but it was coupled with a warning to mind my movements in future in that neighbourhood. I darted for the door. I was free. A quarter of an hour before, I was picturing to myself my own trial and execution. But I was not just yet out of the hands of the dreaded tech. 2 officers were commissioned to escort me home, and they came to the very door with me. I was kept in the police station for over 3 hours, and it was 4 o'clock on Sunday morning before I was really discharged, so to speak, by the police, that is to say, when I reached home. It is impossible to recapitulate here all that passed within that police office. Accusations and insinuations were thrown in my teeth from all sides, and every now and then theories came upon me like a shower of arrows. My position was far more critical than any reader can imagine. If half the theories and insinuations of these men had been correct, there would have been no need for a judge and jury trial. My guilt was so clearly established that the services of the executioner might have been called into immediate requisition. A great many people look upon the incidents I have related as a capital joke, but they have by no means proved so to me. Think of the shame attached to being marched to a police station followed by a howling, uncultivated mob for whose rude insults and wild threats you form a target. But that is nothing compared with the persecution I have suffered. I am daily and almost nightly obliged to touch a portion of Whitechapel, and several times I have been recognised as an arrested suspect. The usual cry has been raised, an excited crowd has encompassed me and treated me with violence, though as yet to no great extent. On these occasions I have had to fight my own battles, the police not appearing till I had made my escape. The police have been good enough to tell me that I would be in danger of my life at the hands of the public if I ventured into Commeical Street and some other thoroughfares during the night. This perhaps I shall not do, at least for a little time. Though I do not in a single detail resemble the different published descriptions of the supposed assassin, I am, up to the present time, the only person who has been arrested twice as the Whitechapel murderer, and I am still under the eye of the police.